This is the Black Experience for all. Ben Wilson is chairman of Beverage and Diamond. Mr. Wilson is a leader on ethics, compliance, and diversity and inclusion. Under his leadership, the firm has been recognized as an Environmental Practice Group of the Year by Law 360 for 2 years in a row, and named Environmental Firm of the Year by U.S. News Best Lawyers.
Ben, I'll thank you. I know how busy you are, and thank you for everything. And I did want to talk a little bit about some of your cases, but one of the things that was so interesting is that I realized in talking to you that I know very little about environmental law and what that really means. And I think, for most people, when you think of law, unfortunately or fortunately, you think of criminal law. And I wanted to ask you about sort of the history and the sort of the importance of environmental law in the United States.
Well, thank you for asking, Adam, and I will not do justice to this topic in the way that a real historian would. But if you can remember the time when the river in Cleveland was on fire, right? The Cuyahoga River.
Mm-hmm.
Remember 3 Mile Island.
Yes.
And these were all major challenges, fish kills that were occurring. And America decided that we really needed to make a change as it related to the environment. So beginning in 1970, you had a whole series of laws. You had something called the National Environmental Policy Act, and NEPA for short. And environmental laws is a practice of acronyms. And so the significance of NEPA, it said that if you had a major federal action that could have a significant impact on the environment, then you had to do something called an environmental impact statement. And back then, they were in the early 1970s, they were the length of a short-term paper. And today, you can have 7 or 8 volumes the size of what used to be the New York City telephone book. And so, and the whole idea was to take a hard look. I used to call it a stop, look, and listen statute. And it requires you to make some judgment of what and identify the various environmental issues. One of the first things you have to look at is, are there alternatives to the approach to the project one is taking, including the no action alternative, that is do nothing. And then you looked at the various issues, water, air, contamination of soil, historic preservation, all of these types of issues, among others. Things like traffic could impact the air, of course. And so that's where NEPA started. One of the first cases that I learned about involving NEPA was called Overton Park. And you're familiar with the interstate highway system.
Yes.
And odd numbers run north and south, like 95, which is the old US Route 1. Even numbers run east and west, like 90 that runs across the upper tier of the United States, or 40 that starts in North Carolina and goes all the way to California. In the course of building I-40, the interstate was going to go through a park called Overton Park. And there was a group of citizens to Save Overton Park, who fought that. And the court concluded that because the construction of this highway was going to require a major federal action or permit that would have a significant impact on the environment, that a full-scale environmental impact statement would have to be done. Thurgood Marshall wrote that decision in Overton Park. Later, you had something called the Clean Water Act, and the whole idea was to make certain that we had clean water. And I won't go through the graphic details of how we handle wastewater, but suffice it to say, primary treatment started in the time of the Egyptians, where the solids settled to the bottom, and secondary treatment in resulted in the introduction of bugs that would kill the bacteria. And so that's where we've been since the 1970s. And then we have the Clean Air Act. You are familiar. There's cities like Los Angeles and cities in China where you cannot see very far because of the dense cover.
Yes.
And suffice it to say, because of the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act in the 1970s, we've seen significant improvement. And because of NEPA, people can't just build projects anytime they want. And the Clean Water Act also had something called Section 404, which said you couldn't fill wetlands. And wetlands are an important part. We found in Hurricane Katrina that a lot of those wetlands had been filled. So there would be trees and grasses that would absorb the wind before it hit places where people lived. And they are also critical to biodiversity. So all of these statutes, later in 1980, you had something called Superfund. And the idea was to clean up these sites where we had soil contamination. And then you had hazardous waste. And that's something that's dealt with under the Resources Conservation Recovery Act. And then we wanted to deal with pesticides. And that's the FIFRA, which is insecticide, fungicide, all of those sides, if you will, that can impact our environment.
Yes.
So these are all.
Yes. I was going to ask you, Ben, because you talk about the early 70s. So this is under the Nixon administration.
Yes.
What made the Nixon administration? Was it the events themselves that versus, why didn't Johnson or Kennedy or anyone else do this beforehand? What was it that made the Nixon administration sort of step up at that particular time, sir?
Well, it's fascinating, Adam. I think that, but for Watergate, President Nixon would have been known as the environmental president because all these statutes were adopted during his time. I do believe that these things did not happen in isolation. There came these incidents that one could not ignore: a river on fire, a 3 Mile Island, smog in Los Angeles. And so we as Americans oftentimes only address issues when they become an emergency or near emergency. And we could no longer turn a blind eye to this. We were facing sprawl and development that was oftentimes uncontrolled. And while we had land use laws that presumably would impact that, there was a recognition that we needed a federal law that at least made certain that government agencies and developers were thinking about how they were impacting the environment. I dare say that we're in a fundamentally different situation than we otherwise would have been, but for the passage of those laws and their rigorous enforcement. A law means nothing unless someone's willing to stand behind it.
Yes.
And we, during the Nixon administration, they developed the Environmental Protection Agency. There was an administrator that was named. The first was Bill Ruckelshaus, who helped start my law firm. And back then, environmental was a nonpartisan issue, and it ought to be a nonpartisan issue. I don't believe the air and the water and soil care what political party you are. Yeah. And I obviously recognize that everyone wants to live in a clean, safe, and healthy environment. So these things are partisan. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to ask you, Ben, then prior to the federal government, what were the states doing, if anything?
Well, it varied from state to state. There were some states that were more aggressive than others. California is an example of a state that was aggressive. But the point is that for some of these issues, you need a national policy. Mm-hmm. Rivers don't stop in one state. The Mississippi River doesn't say, I'm moving from Illinois to Missouri now, and therefore I stop. It just flows.
Right.
And air doesn't know a boundary. It doesn't say I'm now leaving Detroit and going to Windsor, Ontario. I better check myself at the border.
Yes.
And so I think it's that fact that these issues are transboundary is what got us thinking about this from a national standpoint, and now increasingly international. So if there's a nuclear disaster in Japan, it can affect us in the United States.
Yes.
And vice versa. So that what happens in Mexico matters to the US, and what happens in the US matters to Canada or Mexico.
So no, thank you for that, Ben. So I'm curious then, you talk about, again, Nixon, environmental president, the acts that he helped pass. And where did we stand in the early 1970s in comparison to other countries around the world? Were we the leaders in this field or not?
Well, I would say the action we took made us leaders.
Okay.
I think we were as behind as everyone else. But a lot of the laws that you see in Europe, South America, Asia, Africa, they are based upon regimes developed here in the United States. My friend, Professor David Ullman from the University of Michigan, he's now leads environmental crimes at the Department of Justice, has written beautifully about this issue. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of what you see in other countries is based upon our laws, in the same way the U.S. Constitution is used as a model for the constitutions of other countries.
So, reflecting back from the early 70s to where we are now, Ben, as an individual who's been practicing environmental law for 35 years or more, where are we? And I mean, are you pleased with where we are?
Well, I think our report card would read incomplete. I think that in certain areas, clean water, clean air, Superfund, we're making progress and have made significant progress from where we were. But I think we are all aware now of the impact on that we have on climate change. And that is going to be the major issue of this century. But right along with climate change is what I would call environmental justice, climate justice. Who gets the clean water? Who gets the clean air? Who gets access to the resources? Where are these locally unwanted land uses going to be located? We're going to electric vehicles. What happens to those batteries at end of life? And where will they be left? In whose neighborhoods? Right? Yeah. And so we know, at least from the recent storms that we've experienced here in the United States alone, that they have a disparate impact on people of color. And, you know, you don't have to go to a major university to understand that poor people have it hard in times of difficulty. But that's certainly been demonstrated. And so I think these are the great challenges of our day. Climate change, environmental justice, what people are now calling climate justice. So I've taught at Howard University for 17 years now. And when we started, along with my colleagues, I recall we met with Dean Kurt Schmoke, who had been my law school classmate, and we argued that environmental justice would be the major civil rights issue of the 21st century. At that point, we didn't know Joseph Biden would be president. And we had no idea that Senator Kamala Harris or Senator Cory Booker would seek to have legislation passed that addressed environmental justice. We had no idea that all these agencies, federal agencies, would take this issue seriously. They are. and so we were right.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, you talk about environmental justice. I don't know whether this falls into this category or not, but one of the things that we all do that we never really seem to talk about is trash and garbage.
Mhm.
And in terms of landfills, how that affects our environment. I mean, have you dealt with cases that deal with landfills, garbage, trash?
Yes.
How to deal with some of these issues, sir?
Right. We call that solid waste.
Okay.
And so, yes, I have. And there can be environmental justice issues in those contexts. So, for example, we have clients who have transfer stations, and transfer station is where they bring our garbage there and they separate out the plastic from the glass, the paper, things that can be recycled and reused. But the question is, where are those transfer stations located? And oftentimes they're located in poor and minority neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the companies will say, well, we were zoned to be here, and people built homes around us. Sometimes they were zoned, and this was allowed because these were poor neighborhoods, maybe not necessarily well represented on the city council or with the local zoning board. And so these are very, very real issues, and how we manage that solid waste matters. And then there's a question of affordability, and we all recognize the need in terms of public health to manage wastewater, to provide drinking water, to handle solid waste, which is garbage. But who's going to pay for that? And how high must my rates go? And so reconciling the necessity of doing this and the cost of doing it with our ability to pay to ensure that everyone is protected, that's hard work. But that's happening all the time.
So do you think we have a solid waste problem, sir, in the United States?
We always, yes, and we will. But I think you can see a lot of our clients are taking different approaches to packaging that will hopefully reduce the growth of this issue.
Mm-hmm.
We're learning to recycle and getting better at that. So again, what we hope is that we'll address these issues more aggressively before there's an emergency, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to have cancer to see the doctor regularly, and some issues can be prevented, can be mitigated. Please go ahead.
No, you mentioned the next thing I wanted to ask you about was about recycling. Here in our area in Virginia, we recycle and we do it pretty diligently. I mean, actually, in our household, we have more recycles than we have garbage. But not everyone in our community even recycles. So is that something that, in terms of the states or the federal government mandating that recycling is mandatory? Is that something that you see that could happen, sir?
It could, but as we know from our recent experience with mandatory vaccination, some people take great umbrage at being told what to do. What you hope is that people understand the threat that failure to address these issues presents to everyone, right? And so that's the whole point of addressing these issues of clean water, clean air, Superfund. We have to address these issues, not just so that you and I are fine, but for further generations are fine. And we also have to ask ourselves, I think, the golden rule question: would you want this in your neighborhood? What is the right way? What is the fair way? What is the equitable way to divide up these responsibilities? And so again, these are not questions that are issues that are insurmountable. We know in many instances what the answers are. The question is, are we prepared to change our behavior in order to address the issue? And some are more acute than others. Obviously, the issue of climate is an existential threat to life as we know it. And but we can also be swallowed by our own garbage, and we don't want that either.
Yeah.
And so all of these things are important. You've not asked me, but one of the things I've been involved with is with the Environmental Law Institute. We want to bring the rule of law to environmental issues all around the world. And I've been the chair of that board for 5 years. We started in 1970. So a lot of these environmental issues began then. There was that famous book, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
Okay.
Then you have Earth Day, 1969, 1970. Our Environmental Law Institute was started then. Other organizations were started then. The Natural Resources Defense Council was started by young men at Yale Law School. They were reading a story in the New York Times about the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They said there should be an organization like that protects the environment. And so a lot of these organizations started in the 1970s, and they continue today. And I think today, if you take a poll, most voters will say they want the environment to be protected, and they're willing to pay something for that. And now, once you tell them their bill's going to go up 10% or 15%, that might be a different discussion. But I think people generally recognize the importance of it.
Okay.
Connecting their behavior to that issue is the challenge.
Well, you mentioned several times, and again, thank you for sharing that, Ben. You talked about clean water. And again, here in our own home, we use, I used to be very proud of myself to say, I just drink tap water. Well, then after we had a few visitors who came and said, you shouldn't really be drinking tap water. You should be drinking filtered water. So now everything is filtered water. But in terms of clean water, again, how do you sort of see, I don't know if most households use filters. I would probably assume so, since it's a big business. I mean, in terms of the Clean Water Act and providing clean water to communities, again, is it the same question or same answer that you mentioned about solid waste or recycling, that people just have to get smarter about it? I mean, how do we make the water cleaner and better and safer for everyone?
The key is to invest in the facilities and infrastructure necessary to get that done. So one of my clients for many years has been the National Association of Clean Water Agencies. And I also represent cities across the country and other municipal authorities that have built these huge plants that deal with drinking water and wastewater. And so we have to invest in that, and we have to maintain those facilities. We need water conservation programs so we're not wasting the water. As you know, there are various states that don't have adequate water supplies. The water for Los Angeles comes from the Colorado River. And we're fortunate in our area. We have the Potomac, the Patuxent, we have other water resources. But that's something that we just cannot take for granted. And you see this in some of the recent legislation. There's also a question you've probably read about, the cases about lead in the drinking water.
Yes.
And investing the money necessary to remove lead lines, paying for orthophosphates that will prevent the lead from leaching out of the pipes into the water. These are all things that we need to do and must do. And if you think about Katrina, we were able, through the hard work of good people there, and their authority has been my client for many years, and they brought drinking water back in a matter of weeks, and we thought that would take months. But why was that important? not only do we need the water to bathe and cook our own food, but if I own a restaurant in a place like the city of New Orleans, I can't do anything without water, right?
Yes.
And so that was the one lesson we all learned. You can live without a lot of things, Anna, but you cannot live with safe, clean, potable drinking water.
Yes.
And, so that's why I keep saying it is life. Water.
Well, it's interesting because now you mentioned, and you don't have to mention any clients per se, but in terms of cities or states that are getting an A, and you talk about building new facilities for clean water, disposable water, et cetera. What states or cities are sort of getting an A, and are there some cities that are getting, city and states that are maybe getting either incompletes or Fs?
Well, here's what I would say to you. I think the key is resources. So I don't know of any city that could care less about its people. All of them, but they need to have resources. So my hometown is Jackson, Mississippi. And right now, they've had recurring issues with safe drinking water, the management of wastewater. There was a report on 60 Minutes just Sunday of people in rural areas who don't have, in fact, it was Lowndes County, who don't have access to the municipal sewer system. And so that has to change. And so what has happened is when in some places where you have white flight, you can oftentimes lose your tax base and you find yourself in an even deeper hole.
Yeah.
That's why some communities take a place like Nashville, went to a metropolitan form of government that ensured that even as people moved out of the city proper, there were resources.
Well, no, I lost you there. So we were talking about, I mentioned, and you made a great point. You were talking about Jackson, Mississippi. Then you were talking about Nashville turned into
metropolitan form of government.
Yes. So how does that work? And so how does that benefit then? Because you talked about white flight. So tell me then the rationale for becoming a metropolitan, sir.
Well, the rationale for becoming a metropolitan area, it allows you to have a broader tax base, right? And what happens is people will work in the city and they'll move out, live out in the suburbs, either generally if they have children, it's the schools, or sometimes it's just the cost of real estate.
Yes.
It's oftentimes more expensive to live in the city than it is further out. And yet the city can be, your hospitals are often there, your universities are there, your entertainment venues are there. And so I think that's the rationale, is to make certain that we have sufficient resources so that we can deliver those essential services necessary to protect the public health of people. Some of them are in the environmental sphere. And the other obvious issue is politics plays a role. If your congressional delegation is powerful, if they are vocal, if they are coordinated, they can help you get the resources you need. And so all of that matters.
Yes. So is that something in terms of the federal government, its responsibilities, its ability to provide more resources, adequate resources? I mean, is that something that the federal government is doing, can do better? I mean, is it taking money from obviously one pie? Let's say, for example, the military, and spending more money to help provide adequate clean water?
Yeah. Listen, anyone will tell you there's never enough money to go around to do all the things that are necessary. But I would submit to you that protection of the public health is one of the first duties of government, right? Yeah. And so we know no one can live without drinking water. Yeah. No, no one can deal with accompanying disease if we don't manage wastewater properly. So there are certain things that are non-negotiable. And it just seems to me that the provision of these basic services, essential to life itself, they're critical. And in an ideal world, the federal government would not have to intervene. But when you have a discrete and insular minority, as Justice Harlan talked about, like a city like Jackson within a larger state, where the people within the city do not have the political clout to dictate to the state what they need, then some intervention is necessary. Some intervention is essential. And so these issues are critical. If we don't intervene, Flint is the only place isn't the only place with lead pipes. Yeah. And there are other municipalities across the country, and they need help. We need to address these issues. We need to protect the lives of people.
So I'm curious, I had asked earlier about, you had mentioned that in terms of the United States was a leader in terms of environmental laws around the world. Today, are there any other countries who are doing better than we are in terms of some of the things we talked about, clean water, solid waste, recycling, et cetera?
Well, there are certain aspects that other countries do as well or better than the US. I think, to me, this isn't so much an arms race. What I see it as it relates to these fundamental issues, ensuring the health of all of our people. And so I should be able to get a clean water no matter where I live. Mm-hmm. Right? And so think about it. If you're a single mother and you're and it's Saturday night and you have 3 children, you're going to turn on that water and you're going to put your 6-year-old daughter in it. And when you don't let the stopper out, then your 3-year-old son gets in and you bathe the baby in the kitchen sink. And that mother can't go to the Piggly Wiggly or the Food Line or the Kroger or the Albertson Safeway or the Walmart and get the bottled water. They have to rely on the water that comes out the faucet.
Yes.
And are her children any less important, any less valuable than mine or yours? And we don't know which child is going to change the world, and it may be hers. And so the whole point here is that we want people to have these very fundamental and basic necessities, and the provision of clean drinking water, safe drinking water, the proper handling of wastewater. Those are fundamental things. And so that's what I think. And I think that they have to remain a priority. And while I think they are generally not an issue for most of America, there are still parts of America where there are these issues. And the whole point of our American dream is that everyone have one.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot here, Ben. So how close are we so that every American has access to clean and safe water, sir?
Answer is not close enough. And my hometown of Jackson, Miss, is an example of that. But there are other hometowns just as good as mine that are all across America that have some of these issues. And they have to be addressed. They have to be addressed. And all the solutions can't come from Washington. Local people, state and local government have to work to solve a common problem. And And I'd like to think there are good people in all parties who would want to solve these issues.
In terms of entrepreneurs, is this an area that is attracting people like, I don't know, Elon Musk, for example, or Bill Gates, or whoever it might be, people who have deep pockets who want to see change? Are there enough? I guess they're never enough, but are there entrepreneurs who are also in this space that you think that you're taking note of, sir?
Yes, there are entrepreneurs in the space. There are also companies that are taking the long view. There's a concept of private governance where the company says to those who provide products on their shelves, we want you to use a certain type of packaging for your product. And we want your soda in a bottle that's recyclable. We want to have as little paper as possible with our products. And so all of these things are happening. And so when a major company, say like a Walmart or an Amazon or someone says, this is what you have to do in order to put your product in our store, they can have as powerful an impact as the government itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, but there are entrepreneurs. There's one young man I would like to note. His name is Gilbert Campbell, African-American, 40 years old, a graduate of Howard University. He owns the only Black-owned solar company in the United States. And so that's an example of an entrepreneur, a young man who I think is on the cusp of phenomenal progress. And there are companies across America who are interested in working with him. So that's a specific example of an African-American entrepreneur, young man. I think the sky's the limit. One of the things that's exciting about what Gilbert is doing, not only does he want to be a success financially, but he wants to contribute to historically Black colleges and universities by hiring their graduates to be a part of his program and by providing training as it relates to solar on their campuses. I can't think of a better example than that.
Yes, yes.
And what you're also hoping is that there's philanthropy that connects the environment and environmental justice. And there are people who have made significant contributions in recent years, again, to some historically Black colleges and universities. And I hope among the things they are contributing to is not just STEM generally, but STEM as it relates to protection of the environment. And because what we want to do, I think, is to help train up young people who are going to make a difference in the communities in which they live and the communities that have afforded them the opportunities in the first instance.
Yes. No, well, thank you for sharing his name. I will. I'd love to get a chance to chat with him. So I'll try to figure out how to track him down.
Well, I will arrange that. I will track him down for you.
Thank you, Ben. So you've mentioned a couple of times, more than a couple of times, the big word climate change. And I don't necessarily want to get into, they're the deniers, just like the vaccine. I guess you can't, it's hard to deal with those kinds of folks. But from your position, your expertise, climate change, where do you think we are? How dangerous, how volatile is this situation, sir?
Well, I'm not a scientist, but if you believe the scientists, they will tell us that our temperatures are rising. And they would tell us that at a faster rate than they had calculated even 5 years ago. There are many CEOs who are making climate pledges. We will do X by 2030, 2040, 2050. I've had the privilege of working with others at my firm to help advise clients after they've made a pledge, ideally before they make a pledge, figuring out how do we get there? What are the things that we need to do between now and then developing a timeline, a critical path as you went on a construction project. How do we get from here to there by 2040 or 2050? I sit on a board of Pacific Gas and Electric in California, and we are grappling with these issues. How do we meet these pledges that we have made? And how do we meet these pledges that government expects of us? And this is hard work. If it were simple, others would have done it a long time ago. But I'm encouraged, to be honest with you, Adam, that we are beginning to address these issues, but we must quicken our pace. If I use an analogy, if you go back to the advent of World War II, the size of our Army, the size of our Navy, what our production was, we had to make a huge transition. The companies that built cars began building tanks and airplanes, and they exceeded everyone's expectation, including their own, of what they were able to do. And it was this bringing of resources to bear, in addition to some very brave people, women and men, that changed that war. And so we have to attack these issues in the same way. We have to bring our very best people, our very best resources to arrest this problem in time. I may not be here in 2050. Adam, I think you've got a chance, and certainly your son has every chance and expectation of being there.
Yeah.
But we want to leave him a legacy that allows him to flourish and enjoy life, to pursue happiness, as they say.
So how do we deal with countries that say, the United States, you built your economy on industrialization, fossil fuels, you're ahead of us in so many different areas, but it's our turn to use fossil fuels to its fullest, coal and so on and so forth. And you have no right to impose your will on us when you benefited so much from these things in the past. How do we sort of address that, Ben?
Well, listen, I don't think we can take the moral high ground on that, given our history. And yet, it doesn't mean there isn't an urgency.
Yes.
If your father smokes, it doesn't mean that he doesn't have any standing to say to you, Adam, don't smoke. It's not good for your health. And presumably he wouldn't silence his voice because he smoked himself. He would not want you to make the mistakes that he made. I don't mean to suggest that the United States is the parent of these other countries, anything but. But again, environmental is a transboundary issue. So the forests in Brazil matter to us here. Now that doesn't absolve us of meeting our responsibilities here and making sacrifices. But these are the things we have to do if we want this world to be different. And facts are stubborn things. That's what John Adams, the lawyer, said in representing the British soldiers who were defendants in the Boston Massacre trial. Facts are stubborn things. And the facts are that we need every country to pitch in, irrespective of their original responsibility. I think it helps when the United States is willing to pay its fair share, because we are a major contributor. We are, and as is China, the two major contributors. And the developed world has disproportionately contributed to this problem, and sometimes left its mess in other countries who are not directly responsible. Having said that, after we've pointed fingers and assigned responsibility, the question is, what do we do to address a problem that is generational impact? Mm-hmm. If we don't act now, we will never, ever forgive ourselves. And history will not judge us kindly.
I don't want to draw you into politics, Ben, but are you pleased with the current administration and their efforts in dealing with climate change and the environment, sir?
Well, I think we've made some progress. It's not fast enough. And again, to use my war analogy, it's as though, as President Roosevelt at the end of the first quarter of 1942, is he pleased with our production in military arms? I think he would have told you, we've come a long way from where we were in January, but we're not even close to where we need to be. So a lot of rhetoric, but we've got to get this done. And what I will tell you is that the states are not waiting for Washington. They're just not waiting. And so that's why you see in California, New Jersey, Connecticut, states all across the country are addressing these issues. Illinois, Minnesota, Washington State. But we can never have too much help against this common challenge.
Yeah. So I'm curious, where does, if it fits at all, where does space and space exploration fall into what we're talking about, Ben?
Well, the hard part is we don't really know. But suffice it to say, we don't want to make the mistakes in space that we've made in Earth, right? And
yes, because there's already a lot of space junk, from what I understand.
There's a lot of space junk, but we don't want to. There's this concept of the commons, right? And in many communities, you'd have a town square and the law of the commons, and some people would graze their cattle. Some would use it for recreational purposes. Some might grow a crop. But the question is, we have a common purpose and a common good. Not what's best for Adam, not what's best for Ben, but what's best for the whole.
Mm-hmm.
That was the whole point of the Mayflower Compact, right? There were some people who said, we want to go back. You know, this America is not working out the way we wanted it to. And they came to an agreement, an understanding, a common understanding that they would stick it out. And we need a compact to address these issues going forward. And I hope that we'll have that. And I believe that we will. I think there's a generation of young people that can see the future, and they're determined to see it change. And there are others of us who want to help and are helping. So I'm optimistic about that.
Well, I'm curious because you mentioned this gentleman, Gilbert Campbell. I mean, do you think we need, and it's hard, I know you can't just fabricate one, but do we sort of need like a Dr. Martin Luther King of the civil rights movement? Do we need a figure like that in terms of climate change, in terms of environment, to really galvanize people?
It's fascinating. I think individuals matter, and no one would ever for a moment fail to acknowledge the amazing impact of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But I believe if he were here, he would call the roll. He would talk about Vernon Dahmer and Medgar Evers and James Meredith in my state of Mississippi. He would remind us that his lawyer was Fred Gray. He would talk about Jimmy Jackson and Viola Liuzzo, the Detroit housewife who was murdered along the Selma Highway, her crime transporting Black men in a car. He would remember the woman who voted for the first time in Selma in her 90s. He would remember the students Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter Galt, who integrated the University of Georgia while escorted by Vernon Jordan. He would remember Vivian Malone Jones, who integrated the University of Alabama, he would remember Wiley Brandt, and he would remember A.P. Turo. He would remember Mr. Luby in Nashville, lawyers who helped make a difference. So it was never one person. It was always people, and people of the most humble origin who gave what they had. And so yes, it's great to have this charismatic leader, but it's more important, I think, to have the action. And I think sometimes people can use the absence of a charismatic leader as an excuse for not doing anything. And sometimes they're waiting for the second coming. Well, there's an urgency now.
Yeah.
And maybe if we act now, we might not need the second coming. And so, so my view is that what we need are people acting on the laws that we have now, enforcing them. We need people keeping and companies keeping their promises. And we need individuals like you and me in our small little corner of the world doing what your family does, the recycling. There's nothing that prevents anyone else from doing the same thing that you're doing.
Yes.
And, so I hope that people will see this. I've had the privilege of working on some other key matters. The Duke Energy case was one where I was a monitor. They had a terrible coal ash spill in the Eden River that separates North Carolina from Virginia. And I recall explaining to the federal judge then the story that I just told you, that there would be somewhere on, this was a Friday afternoon, but I said sometime tomorrow night, there's a single mother who's going to run that bathwater for her children. She needs to be able to trust that water. And my job was to help restore that trust. When I had the privilege of working with Larry Thompson, who was the monitor on the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal, I was his deputy for emissions. That scandal was about lying about emissions from automobiles. People need to be able to trust that what companies say is true. People need to be able to count on the fact that the environment will be protected. One of the things that is of interest, we knew then people were moving to electric vehicles, right? And they were a leader in that area. What happens with the batteries? Cobalt and lithium are essential elements of a given battery. And cobalt comes from one of the most repressive countries in the world, the Republic of the Congo.
Yes.
And so it's important not only that what we do, but how we do it matters.
Yes.
And so our goal is not only to stop something bad that has happened in the past, but ensure that we avoid it in the future by asking ourselves challenging questions in advance, right? Is it better to buy an umbrella after the storm has already started, or is it better to leave the house with your umbrella in hand? I think that we're far better off. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And those cases were important because those companies are iconic companies.
Yes.
Right. And restoring confidence they have in themselves and the confidence that others have in them is essential. I didn't realize Volkswagen was the 6th largest company in the world. And when we went to the Czech Republic, or we went to Spain, we went to various countries around the world, they were the number one industry in that country. And when I went to China, when I went to Russia, and I saw that. When I went to Mexico City, the most desired job at a facility not far from Mexico City was a job with Volkswagen. And so those jobs, not only what they do not only impacts the hundreds of thousands of people they employ, but all the other people whose employment is dependent on their industry.
Yes.
And so there's this interdependence, Adam, that if man is to not simply survive, but to thrive, like William Faulkner said when he received that Nobel Prize in 1950, his prediction, man would not only survive, but he would thrive. Not unless we are prepared to make the sacrifices necessary. And
no, again, thank you, Ben. And you, and I've already kept you. And I wanted to ask one more question for today, because I did want to get into in detail about Volkswagen, about Duke Energy at some point, and I was hoping to do that today, but obviously we got onto this wonderful topic. But I want to ask you then, just about sort of in summation then, on climate change. You talk about, you feel somewhat optimistic about where we are and where we're going. Is there sort of one final thought on climate change that you would like to sort of impart to us, Ben?
Yes, I think we know what to do now for the most part. I think we must pick up the pace. We must do it faster. And I think that's the key to changing a culture. I think that's the key to addressing this environmental issue, which, as I say, is an existential threat. If I could make one final point for today.
Yes, sir.
Is that my friend Larry Thompson says the law is it's a profession. It's about more than the money. I couldn't agree with him more. There's not a civil rights movement. There's not an environmental movement. There's not a women's rights movement without the law, and without people willing to defend rights. And so I think it really matters. One of the cases that I had that meant a great deal to me, I represented a deaf man, or rather his family, the widow of a deaf man and their 4 children. He had been choked to death by campus police officers at Gallaudet University, the university for the deaf, the National University for the Deaf here in Washington. And he was choked to death by 2, 4, 6, and then 8 officers, male and female, black and white. And one of the great challenges was they did not know how to sign on that campus, so they could not speak the language. 2 of his 4 children were hearing impaired, and they attended the elementary school on the campus, and he was going to pick them up and his wife, who were waiting for him. Yeah. And they restrained him and did not want him to go, I believe, in the cafeteria where he was waiting. We ultimately resolved that case. It ultimately was settled. But the whole point of the law is to make certain that people have an opportunity. Nothing could ever bring the father back, but hopefully our resolution helped that family and help those children navigate life in a way that they might not otherwise. So the law is oftentimes an inadequate remedy for the problems that we face, but it's the best one that we have. Yeah. Because when we follow the rule of law, it's not might that makes right. It's right that makes right.
Yes.
And not as defined by Ben, but by an independent judiciary. And that's what we need.
Yeah.
This is the Black Experience for all. If you like what you hear at the Black Experience, please consider clicking on the join button to support our nonprofit. I'm Adam P. Kennedy. Thank you for joining us. This is the Black Experience for all.